Hi there. Today on Typical Books, it is my nonfiction November wrap up, and I'm talking about a little true crime. So these are two of the books that I'm reading right now. I've read this one and I'm reading this one. I didn't quite make it through the whole thing for November because I did read one other book, start another one, and read a short book for nonfiction November, all nonfiction. I even put down a Stephen Graham Jones book so that I could stick to nonfiction in November. Nuts, I know. So Behind the Horror by Dr. Lee Mellor. You've heard me talk about Lee before. He is the host of Murder Was the Case. He was the progenitor of the magazine, the short-lived but so seminal and so amazing magazine Serial Killer Quarterly that I still have printed out copies of around here somewhere. And he is a criminologist, and he has a specialty in understanding necrophilia. And Lee's writing, as I've said before, is very welcoming. He's not caught up in academic jargon, although he's also caught up in academic jargon in that he wants to normalize this, it seems. And many of his podcasts are so-called academy episodes where he teaches you a class. He's one of the first people that taught a class in criminology or abnormal psychology or serial killers in virtual reality. So he had a VR headset, his students did as well, and they attended a class. And it wasn't just a class, I believe that it was open. It was a free course on serial killer pathology. Fantastic stuff. So he takes a love of true crime and brings it to the silver screen with Behind the Horror. And this book goes through many of the titles that you may be familiar with as like seminal horror films that are based in true stories. And some even surprised me. And if you know, I have a podcast. Me and my co-host Wes Dead Air Knipe at splatterpictures.net talk on Dead Air podcast about horror films all the time. I had no idea that The Lighthouse was based on a true story, and it was fantastic. It's pretty close to the true story in some respects. And I thought that was an interesting film. It's not necessarily horror, but I mean, the story it tells is horrific. Yes, the true story is maybe scarier when you really put yourself in the shoes of these people. Knowing that it's real brings it back into horror for me to a certain extent. So thanks, Lee, for that. We cover a lot of death here from turn of the century Germany. We have Ed Gein. We talk about the possession of Roland Doe that inspired The Exorcist. We talk about the perfect murder, crime of the century, so to speak. Neville Heath, one of everyone's favorite. The Jersey Shore shark attacks that inspired Jaws, along with other like horrible frenzied shark attack stories. The Town That Dreaded Sundown, one of my pet favorites. Poltergeist. I had no idea Poltergeist was based very closely on a true story. Amityville Horror, of course, one of my favorites we've talked about before. Silence of the Lambs, speaking on Ted Bundy, Green River Killer, Gary Heidnik, one of my other pet favorites, Ed Kemper, Jerry Brudos. So many people went into that. Same when you talk about Leatherface, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre does make its way in here, of course. Scream, The Mothman Prophecies, Wolf Creek, which, that is near and dear to my heart for whatever reason. I'm not from Australia. I don't understand. But Wolf Creek and The Conjuring. But we got The Conjuring, Annabelle, and The Conjuring 2. All of those have to do with the Warrens, of course. And tangentially, Hans Holzer is involved in one or two of those. And The Witch and The Lighthouse. So it takes it from very early film, M, City Searches for a Murder, to The Witch and the Lighthouse, some Robert Eggers films that are very, very popular. So highly recommended. Really good reading that goes to synopsize the films briefly and then into what inspired them at length, and really great writing too. Lee has another book coming out shortly, I believe next spring or spring, and it is a deep dive into some conspiracy type talk, so I'm very interested and looking forward to that. Before I get into Sons of Cain, I'll talk about the non-fiction books that I read on my e-reader. Providence After Dark by T.E.D. Klein. Providence After Dark and Other Writings is about H.P. Lovecraft, and he goes to the first Necronomicon and could be World Fantasy, I'm not sure, and it is a really great report on those particular conventions and who was there. So it's a wonderful snapshot. Like, if you want to know what the thoughts are between some of the things that were written between Robert Bloch and H.P. Lovecraft, to hear it from Robert Bloch's point of view. He talks about it at these conventions, which is captured in some of the writing here. Some of the interviews with T.E.D. Klein as well, when he speaks about Lovecraft and the weird, is captured in here. A little bit of snapshots of Frank Belknap Long and other authors that were present at these things and spoke. Even if it's a brief sentence, it's sort of an interesting mining expedition, as it were, to go on reading this book. So it's really, really, I think, even more valuable than Mr. Klein would have you believe. So I find that the serial killer talk has been a really nice break from some very cerebral talk on weird fiction. I've got a copy of Michelle McNamara's I'll Be Gone in the Dark. I haven't started this yet, but I picked it up during November, and I got overly excited because it was near the end of nonfiction November, and I thought, oh yeah, I can just power through Sons of Cain and get to this. Yeah. More serial killers. Michelle McNamara had written this, and it was like her passion project. And she passed away right before the Golden State Killer was apprehended. So I'd like to read this knowing that, like many people have, and see where and how close she would have really got with this very interesting book, from what I understand. And the genesis of this book is just as interesting as what is between the pages. This I picked up on BookBub, so it was on special. So I was very pleased to see that. So those who are interested in nonfiction, don't overlook BookBub and their horror section for a lot of nonfiction reads. Now, Sons of Cain by Peter Vronsky, part and parcel with Behind the Horror. I had only heard of Peter Vronsky via Lee's podcast. He's interviewed Peter Vronsky and worked with him numerous times, and they talk very extensively and candidly and openly. There's other people on Lee's show that have written books as well. It's between Lee's podcast and Dan Zupansky's True Murder podcast. You can find so much nonfiction true crime there. It's fantastic. So if you are a fan, I highly recommend check out all the back catalog and current episodes and upcoming episodes of Murder Was a Case with Lee Miller and all of the people he's had on his show, Peter Vronsky among them. So Peter Vronsky, to hear him talk, he sounds like a cool uncle that your parents don't want to keep talking at parties because he talks about his work, right? And it's just fantastic. He talks about the serial killers like it's the first time you've ever heard them. And if you're like me and you've heard the story of, say, Ed Kemper 20 zillion times, or even Richard Cottingham, who he bumped into, no pun intended, he'll talk about that at the beginning of this book. If you are interested, you can go onto Amazon and read the beginning of this book, and it talks about his introduction to why he pursues the idea of, have you met a serial killer? And that's where this starts out. And then the idea of, well, you must have, because we are all, in one way or another, sons of Cain and have descended from serial killers, every one of us. So it is a really interesting take. But the way that he describes these serial killers that you may be very familiar with, it's like the first time you've ever heard mention of it because of the way he tells his story. His speech and the way he talks and the comfortable way he talks and the accessible way he talks in interview is the exact same way he writes. So this has been a treat so far. I'm really enjoying this story, going again, much like Behind the Horror, from the beginning of time, as it were, and recorded history, and talking about origin of werewolves and vampires, going up into present day serial killers. And he has another book coming out soon about the serial killer epidemic, as it were, between 1970 to 2000, somewhere in there, where he even points out at the beginning of this book about 85% of serial killers in the last century happened during that time. So there was something going on, to the point that the CDC was even interested. So fantastic stuff. I really highly recommend this, Lee's books, and of course anyone that have ever been interviewed on Lee's show, and check out Dan Zupansky's show True Murder, because Lee was just recently interviewed on there. Sons of Cain, Peter Vronsky does show up on that show as well to talk about this book. So a huge fount of awesome true crime. So aside from a whole bunch of assorted deep dives on Zodiac Killer, that was my nonfiction reading for November. Coming up soon on my top 5 most extreme horror, and that's my top 5, of course. There's a lot of extreme horror out there, but these are the ones that really had impact with me. And I've read quite a bit of the Ruffies. So it's going to be a neat list. It's going to be really fun. I've been looking forward to it. The stack of books has been sitting here for weeks, actually. And of course, a review of The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. That will be coming up shortly as well. Thank you very much for hanging out during Nonfiction November. If you've read any of these or have a true crime nonfiction book that isn't Helter Skelter, because I've read that a lot, many times, and that isn't Devil in the White City, because I have no interest in reading that one, but if there's one that really got to you, let me know in the comments below. And make sure that you have an ooky, spooky day.